Hey traders, Ben Watson here with you. We're going to take a look at what float is and where to find it on Schwab.com and on Thinkorswim, and what it tells us about potential stock behavior. So, a couple of quick reminders as we get started here. Remember that everything we talk about simply for illustrative and educational purposes only. We're going to be using the Thinkorswim desktop software platform, specifically the paper money version, to talk about this today as we get into this discussion. And remember, the past performance is no guarantee of future results. So let's pop over here really quickly to the Schwab.com website, and we're going to talk a bit about what float is and what it means to us as investors. So float is very simply the number of shares available for public trading once you take out all of those shares that are held by company executives, by founders, by large insiders, and by strategic investors. So it takes total shares outstanding, strips out all of those, and what's left is float. And so the idea behind float is that if the same number of buyers showed up for a stock that had a high float versus a stock that had a low float, those investors are going to be able to move price more easily in a stock that has a low float. So it's more sensitive to price changes based on supply and demand. A stock that has a higher float, less sensitive, harder to move. So for those traders that are looking for big moves quickly, it might be an indication of small float that they're looking for. If investors are looking for persistence of trend and durability of trend, then a high float stock might be the order to choose. So let's take a look at where we can find float on Schwab.com. And that's going to be the first place that we're going to start. Now, on Schwab.com, we've got to kind of infer that information a little bit. So I am on the research tab on Schwab.com, and I've got a symbol pulled up. In this case, I happen to pull up NVIDIA. NVDA is the symbol. Some of you might be familiar with this particular stock. And over on the right-hand side of the research tool overview page, I've got information about the number of shares outstanding, the numbers of shares held by institutions, the market capitalization, and then we've got this section titled Short Interest. So first of all, we're going to take a look at the number of shares outstanding. This particular name has 24 billion, with a B, shares outstanding. That's a fairly large number of shares outstanding, but that's only part of the picture. Because the next thing that we need to do is we need to look at the number of, or the percentage of shares outstanding minus that information, those institutions, the insiders, the preferred shares, those types of things. So the percentage of shares outstanding outside of those characteristics is 1.28% in this particular case. The next thing that we need to do in looking at float is look at the number of shares short. So there's 310, essentially 310 million shares short against that 24 billion shares outstanding. Not a lot of shares short in this particular case. But what we're going to get to in terms of deriving that float information is that percentage of shares outstanding measurement as a percentage. That percentage being relatively low suggests that there's a fairly high float. Now, the Schwab.com website does not display float directly. For that, we've got to go to Thinkorswim. But before we do that, I want to show you what a low float stock might look like here on the Schwab.com website. Now, why does that matter? Why does NVIDIA having a high float matter? It's harder to move the stock. But let's take a look at another name, and I'm just going to choose one from this list. I happen to know this particular name. This is SERV. This is Serve Robotics. It's a robotics company that builds robots for the hospitality industry. Micro cap stocks, so much smaller market capitalization, number of shares outstanding, as opposed to 24 billion that we saw on Nvidia. This company has 77 million shares outstanding, significantly less. Then we take a look at percentage of shares outstanding. That's our derived float information. If we take a look at that percentage of shares outstanding suggests that this particular company has a low float. So what's the inverse relationship here? Percentage of shares outstanding being higher is an indication of a lower float. Percentage of shares outstanding being smaller is an indication of higher float. With me so far? It's a little bit easier to see that on the Thinkorswim desktop software platform. So now that we've got that information here on Schwab.com, let's pop over to the Thinkorswim desktop software platform. And this is a new release as of June of 2026, showing float in a watch list. And it is one of our watch list columns that's available for display. So all you need to do is go over to that gear icon over here on the right-hand side, click on Customize, and choose out of the list Float, and it's going to display that float information. Now, in order to display that, you've got to put it over on the right-hand side, and I've got float there. Two choices for float. You've got current, which is the up-to-date information on the float, and you've got a 5-year average. But thinking about a 5-year average of the number of shares that's available and in that float, we know that over the course of the last 5 years, things have probably changed. So it can give you an average, but it's probably not going to give you a good indication of where that current float is now. A good comparison might be to do one column with current float, however, and another column with 5-year average of float. But what I've got here is a list of the stocks in the S&P 500, and I've got that float column displayed, and there are those 24 billion shares of Nvidia out there in that float, basically as an indication of a high float stock. Another high float stock in this list, also Apple and Amazon and Microsoft, the ones that you might expect have a high float. So it's a lot harder for investors to come in with a trade and move the price of those stocks specifically. So that suggests that maybe their trend is a little more durable. It is a little bit less sensitive. Doesn't guarantee that, but maybe a little bit less sensitive to short squeezes, for instance, or manipulation, or simply just price movement based on news. Doesn't guarantee that news won't move the market, but that could be an indication that maybe those moves are a little more smoothed out. Now, if I resort this list by clicking on the column header, now I've sorted that list by lowest float, and we can see that some of those stocks in here, AutoZone and Ralph Lauren and Lennox and Domino's Pizza and others within that space, have a relatively low float. So if we might think about it from this standpoint, a small number of shares being traded might move a stock like AutoZone much more significantly than, say, for instance, an Apple or an Nvidia. Now, neither is necessarily better or worse. It just depends on what movement a trader is trying to find. So one other thing to think about is that the relative volatility levels, meaning the likelihood of movement for a stock with low float, might be higher than for a stock with higher float. So when picking those two types of considerations, float can be a tool that a trader can use to determine what type of stock do I want to have and what type of behavior would I likely be seeing exhibited by that stock given news-driven movement or, say, for instance, an earnings announcement. So that's float here on the Thinkorswim platform as well as on the Schwab.com website. And once again, remember, past performance is no guarantee of future results, and investing involves risk. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you soon.